Dr. Vale Soren of the Keth Academic Consortium had spent 11 standard cycles studying what the galactic community formally classified as a Tier 2 emergent civilization, a designation that meant, in plain terms, interesting but not yet relevant. Humanity. The classification wasn't cruel. It was bureaucratic, which is often worse. The Keth did not hate humans. They simply had not yet found a reason to take them seriously. In the long history of the consortium's contact records, Tier 2 species usually followed predictable trajectories. They developed faster-than-light travel somewhere between their 2nd and 4th century of industrialization, made first contact with a galactic neighbor, embarrassed themselves diplomatically 2 or 3 times, and then either integrated into the broader interstellar community or quietly collapsed from internal pressures before they could become anyone's problem. Vale Soren had studied 7 such species before turning her academic attention toward Earth. She did not expect humanity to surprise her. Her initial assessment was methodical, drawn from intercepted broadcast signals, long-range atmospheric spectrometry, and 3 years of close proximity observation aboard a consortium survey vessel parked in the outer belt of the Sol system. She catalogued human civilization with the careful detachment of someone filling out a form. Population: approximately 9.4 billion, concentrated across a single terrestrial body and nascent off-world settlements. Technological index: subwarp. Functional FTL achieved approximately 31 standard years prior to observation. Drive efficiency rated at 34% of Keth baseline. Military capacity, estimated. Incomplete. Based on signal intercepts and orbital infrastructure scans, significant investment, but scale unclear. That last line had given her pause even then. She remembered noting it in her preliminary report and moving on. The uncertainty of human military scale was a data gap, nothing more. She filed her first report to the consortium's Contact Evaluation Board with a moderate recommendation: no immediate action required. Species shows curiosity-driven expansion, manageable risk profile, recommend continued passive observation. The board accepted her recommendation without comment. 3 years later she would think about that report often. What Vale Soren had not fully appreciated, what almost no one in the consortium had appreciated, was the particular nature of how humanity had reached the stars. Most spacefaring civilizations arrive at faster-than-light travel through long periods of scientific development, each discovery building incrementally on the last. There is usually a grace period of several centuries between the moment a species first achieves orbit and the moment they achieve warp-equivalent travel. Long enough for the civilization to stabilize. Long enough to develop something like perspective. Humanity had compressed that timeline by approximately 200 years. Not through genius alone. Through necessity. The early 21st century on Earth had not been a story of uncomplicated progress. Climate disruption, resource scarcity, a cascade of regional conflicts, and 2 near-extinction level pandemics had driven human scientific investment not toward exploration but toward survival. Every major breakthrough in human physics and engineering between 2030 and 2120 had been motivated, at least in part, by the terrifying possibility that the species might not make it. Fusion power. Atmospheric carbon capture at industrial scale. Deep-sea agriculture. High-efficiency propulsion. Each of these technologies had been born in desperation and refined in crisis. When humanity finally cracked the mathematics of fold space travel in 2141, it was not celebrated as a triumph of exploration. It was celebrated as a relief. As evidence that maybe, there was a way forward that didn't end in ash. Vale Soren had recorded all of this in her data archives. She had read the intercept translations of early human FTL broadcasts. She had noted the cultural pattern. She had not understood what it meant. A civilization that reached the stars through survival didn't think about space the way Keth did. The Keth had arrived at FTL from a position of comfort, driven by curiosity. When they encountered danger in the void, they had the luxury of retreating, reassessing, consulting the consortium board. Humans had spent 2 centuries learning that retreat was not always an option. That was the thing Vale Soren's classification methodology had no metric for. Not courage exactly. Adaptability under terminal pressure. She met her first human in person on Waystation Hellas 4, a consortium transit hub positioned between the outer edge of settled Keth space and the expanding frontier where several younger civilizations, including humanity, had begun establishing trade corridors. His name was Commander Elias Thar. He was the senior officer aboard the ECV Resolute, one of 12 ships in Earth's nascent combined void fleet, assigned to the Hellas corridor as part of a cooperative patrol arrangement with the consortium. Vale Soren had expected someone who matched humanity's file. Energetic. Curious. Perhaps slightly overconfident in the way all Tier 2 species were when they first began mixing with elder civilizations. That was not what she expected. He was quiet. Measured. He moved through the station with the particular economy of someone who had spent years in confined spaces and had learned not to waste motion. He listened more than he spoke. When he did speak, he was precise. She introduced herself as a consortium academic studying human expansion patterns. He thanked her for her interest without either pride or resentment. He asked if she had any questions. She had prepared a list of 34. They spoke for 6 hours. By the end of it, she had crossed out most of her preliminary assumptions and begun writing new ones. She asked him, near the end of their conversation, what humanity's strategic priorities were in the Hellas corridor. She expected the standard Tier 2 answer: trade access, diplomatic visibility, technology exchange. They thought about it for a moment. Stability, he said. We've had enough instability at home to last us a while. We'd like the neighborhood to stay quiet. And if it doesn't? She asked. He didn't hesitate. Then we handle it. Not boastful. Not aggressive. Just the flat, tired certainty of someone who has handled difficult things before and expects to handle difficult things again. Vale Soren filed a revised note in her academic journal that evening. Reassessment required. Humanities military psychology does not map cleanly to Tier 2 behavioral models. Recommend escalating observation priority. The board approved the revision. 11 months later, the Rathcali crossed the Hellas boundary with a fleet of 40 warships, and Vale Soren's entire framework for understanding humanity collapsed and rebuilt itself in the space of 4 days. The Rathcali were not conquerors in the classical sense. That distinction mattered to Vale Soren as she stood at the observation deck of Waystation Hellas 4 and watched the contact reports populate across the tactical display. The Rathcali did not invade for territory or resources in any conventional understanding. They expanded because expansion was the structural logic of their civilization, a species whose social hierarchy was built entirely around the accumulation of domain, the Rathcali word that translated most accurately as controlled volume of space, but carried cultural weight closer to the human concept of honor. To hold domain was to have standing. To lose domain was to become irrelevant. And the Hellas corridor, rich in navigational access points and positioned between 3 developing trade networks, represented, in Rathcali terms, an unclaimed prize. It was not unclaimed, of course. That was the problem. The consortium's legal framework was clear on this point. The Hellas corridor had been designated a shared transit zone under the Interstellar Community's Third Compact, and both the Keth and humanity had signatories on the arrangement. The Rathcali were not compact members. They had been invited twice to negotiate access terms. They had declined twice, with the particular silence that in Rathcali diplomatic culture communicated something between indifference and contempt. And now 40 of their warships, each one significantly larger than the standard consortium patrol vessel, their hulls built in the angular, aggressive geometry that Rathcali shipwrights had developed over 3 centuries of regional warfare, were crossing the outer boundary marker and heading directly for the Waystation. The station's own defense grid was modest. Designed for deterrence, not engagement. Against 40 ships, it would delay, not stop. Vale Soren pulled up the active fleet roster for the corridor. 12 ships. The ECV Resolute and 11 others from humanity's combined Void fleet, distributed across the patrol routes between Hellas 4 and the 3 nearest transit points. The largest human vessel in the corridor was the Resolute herself, a heavy patrol cruiser that the consortium's own analysts had rated at approximately 60% combat effectiveness compared to a standard Keth warship of equivalent tonnage. Against 1 Rathcali cruiser, the Resolute would be outmatched. Against 40, the numbers were simply not worth calculating. The consortium's crisis protocol was straightforward. In the event of a superior hostile force approaching a shared asset, the station would issue a formal protest through diplomatic channels, the patrol forces would withdraw to avoid unnecessary casualties, and the consortium would convene an emergency arbitration session that would, in all likelihood, result in some renegotiation of corridor access rights with the Rathcali. It was not a proud policy, but it was a rational one. The consortium had learned, over millennia of galactic politics, that the difference between a border incident and a war was often just a question of whether someone decided to fight back. Vale Soren watched the crisis protocol notification appear on the tactical display. All patrol forces, stand down, withdraw to secondary positions, await diplomatic resolution. She watched the acknowledgement signals come in from the human ships. 9 confirmed immediately. 2 confirmed with a delay. 1 did not respond. She already knew which ship it was. Commander Elias Thar's voice came through the station's communication relay at 0347 station time, addressed not to his fleet but to the Rathkali flagship directly. Vale Soren had access to the translation feed. She sat down. Rathkali vessel, this is Commander Elias Thar of the ECV Resolute Earth Combined Void Fleet, operating under 3rd Compact Authority in designated Transit Zone Hella 7. You are crossing a marked boundary without clearance. Please state your intent. There was a pause of approximately 40 seconds. In Rathkali communication etiquette, a response to an unranked contact, which is how they would categorize a Tier 2 patrol commander, was not obligatory. The silence was in its own way an answer. Thar sent the message again. Then a 3rd time. On the 4th transmission he added a single line. I will ask once more. After that I'm treating your approach as hostile. The station's tactical officer, a Keth named Prelin who had 20 years of experience in the corridor, turned to Vale Soren with an expression she had never seen on a Keth face before. Something close to disbelief. He cannot be serious, Prelin said. Vale Soren did not respond. She was watching the Resolute's position on the display. The ship had not retreated. It had changed course. Moving not away from the Rathkali fleet but perpendicular to it, positioning itself between the incoming ships and the way station. 1 vessel. Between 40. And a station. He's moved into intercept position, Prelin said in the flat voice of someone narrating something they cannot process. He's actually moved into intercept position. The Rathkali fleet had not slowed. But their formation had shifted slightly. The 40 ships had tightened, not in preparation for an attack run, Vale Soren thought, but in the adjustment of something encountering unexpected resistance. A recalculation. She had spent years studying military psychology across a dozen species. She knew what a formation adjustment meant. It meant the Rathkali commanders were looking at the Resolute and trying to understand what they were seeing. A lone patrol cruiser, rated at a fraction of their firepower, refusing to move. The mathematics made no sense. That was the point. Thar's 4th transmission had not been answered. 52 seconds after his deadline passed, the Resolute broadcast on all open frequencies, Consortium, Rathkali, and General Emergency channels simultaneously. To all vessels in Hellas Corridor. This is the ECV Resolute. We are in contact with an uncleared formation of 40 Rathkali warships currently crossing boundary marker Hella 7. I have issued 4 formal warnings. None have been acknowledged. I am formally declaring this an active threat to a compact designated transit zone. I am requesting immediate reinforcement from all available Consortium and allied assets. Until reinforcement arrives or the situation is resolved, the Resolute will hold position. Prelin stared at the communications panel. He has no reinforcements available. The nearest Consortium response force is 19 hours away. He knows that, Vale Soren said quietly. Then why? Because it doesn't matter. She found herself leaning forward. He's not positioning to win the engagement. He's forcing the Rathkali to make a choice. If they fire on him, they've committed an act of war against a compact signatory. 19 hours of documentation, broadcast on every open channel. They don't just take the corridor, they take the political consequences of how they took it. Prelin was silent for a moment. That's an extremely sophisticated calculation for a Tier 2 commander. Yes, Vale Soren said. It is. The Rathkali fleet slowed. Not stopped. Slowed. The flagship's engines, detectable by drive signature, dropped to approximately 30% output. The 40 ships behind it followed. Vale Soren watched the display and felt something she had not expected to feel in a crisis situation. Academic excitement. The pure, focused thrill of watching a subject prove your classification system inadequate in real time. She pulled out her research terminal and began typing. Revised assessment, Commander Thar Human Military Doctrine. Note, standard Tier 2 threat response models do not apply. In the corridor, 1 ship held its position. 40 did not advance. The Rathkali did not fire. Not immediately. In the 6 hours that followed Commander Thar's broadcast, the 40-ship formation held its reduced speed and Vale Soren watched the tactical display with the focused attention of someone witnessing something that would either become a historical footnote or a turning point in interstellar politics. She could not yet determine which. The station's senior diplomatic officer, a Keth named Counselor Tessavin who had managed 3 separate Rathkali border incidents over a 40-year career, called an emergency situation briefing at 0600 station time. Vale Soren attended not as an academic observer but because Tessa Vin had specifically requested her analysis on human behavioral patterns. She was, at that moment, the only consortium expert on record who had spent meaningful time with humanities military officers. That expertise, which 6 months ago had seemed pleasantly niche, now felt unexpectedly urgent. "Walk me through what he's doing," Tessa Vin said without preamble, pulling up the corridor display. Vale Soren gathered her thoughts. "He's applying cost economics to a force asymmetry problem. The Resolute can't win a direct engagement, he knows that. But winning the engagement isn't the objective. The objective is making any aggressive move by the Rathkali more expensive than they're willing to pay. He's one ship. He's one ship with a live broadcast to every open channel in 3 transit networks. Any weapons fire directed at the Resolute is recorded, attributed, and distributed before the engagement is over. The Rathkali want the corridor. They don't want an interstellar incident on public record that gives the compact legal justification to formalize their exclusion from 6 trade routes for the next decade." Tessa Vin studied the display. "So he's using our diplomatic framework as a weapon. He's using your diplomatic framework as armor. There's a difference." She hesitated. "And I think he understood that before he ever made that first transmission." That was the part she kept returning to. Thar had positioned the Resolute and issued his warnings within minutes of the Rathkali boundary crossing. No consultation with the station. No request for guidance from the consortium. He had read the situation, calculated the political geometry, and moved. Not impulsively. With deliberate speed. "What's the Rathkali risk tolerance in this scenario?" Tessa Vin asked. "Historically moderate. They absorb diplomatic friction when the strategic gain is high. But this corridor isn't high value enough to justify a documented first strike on a compact-affiliated vessel." She paused. "Unless they think no one significant will actually respond. And will we?" Vale Soren looked at the counselor. "That's your decision, not mine." Tessa Vin was quiet for a moment. Then, "What would Thar assume we'll do?" "I think he's already accounted for the possibility that we won't respond in time. That's why he broadcast publicly. He's not relying on our intervention. He's relying on the consequences of our inaction being visible." The counselor's expression shifted, something between respect and discomfort. "He's putting pressure on us. He's aligning our incentives with his position," Vale Soren said carefully. "That's not the same thing." At 0814 station time, something changed on the display. The 11 human ships that had confirmed the withdrawal order, the ones that had acknowledged the consortium crisis protocol and pulled back to secondary positions, began to move. Not toward the Rathkali fleet. Not in any dramatic formation. 2 by 2, then 3, then 4, the other ships of humanity's corridor patrol began repositioning. Not to the Resolute's exact position, but to the broader intercept zone. Spreading across the corridor approaches in a loose screen that, together, covered every viable approach vector to the station. They were not forming a battle line. They were forming a perimeter. Vale Soren studied the positioning. "They haven't done this tactically," she said quietly, more to herself than anyone in the room. "They've done it geometrically. If the Rathkali want to reach this station on any of the 4 main approach vectors, they pass through a human ship." One of the station's tactical analysts, a young Keth named Orin who had been tracking the movement, turned from his console. "They withdrew under protocol. They're not supposed to." "They withdrew to secondary positions," Vale Soren said. "Those are their secondary positions now." Orin stared at the display. "That's a reinterpretation of the order." "Yes. That's..." He stopped. "Did Thar coordinate this?" "His communications to his fleet have been restricted channel. I don't know what was said." She watched the ships settle into position. "But the result is interesting. 11 ships that technically complied with the withdrawal order are now, in practice, extending his screen." The Rathkali formation had slowed again. Their sensory emissions, detectable at this range by the station's passive arrays, had increased. They were scanning extensively now. Mapping the human positions. Trying to understand what they were looking at. At 11:03 station time, the Rathkali flagship transmitted. Not to the station. Not to the consortium. To the Resolute directly. The translation came through with the particular flatness that Keth translation algorithms always produced for Rathkali communication. A language that relied heavily on tonal stress and had never translated elegantly into Keth syntax. "You are one fleet of 12, underarmed, undermassed. You cannot hold this position against our formation. Withdraw and we will record no hostile action. Stand and we will resolve this corridor question today. Vale Soren found herself holding her breath. Thar's response came 11 seconds later. I read your offer. My answer is the same as before. You're in a compact transit zone without clearance. Turn around or identify your intent. Pause. You understand the consequences of your position? Yes, Thar said. Do you understand the consequences of yours? The Rathcali flagship did not respond for 4 minutes and 17 seconds. Vale Soren used that silence to pull up everything she had on Rathcali command decision-making psychology. The flagship commander was senior military, which in Rathcali hierarchy meant someone who had accumulated domain through 20 or 30 years of territorial engagements. Someone who understood the value of force and the arithmetic of confrontation. What that commander was encountering now was something outside the arithmetic. A force that was demonstrably insufficient to stop them was behaving as though it could. Not through delusion, the human positioning was precise and deliberate, which meant they knew the numbers, but through some other calculation. Rathcali command culture did not have a clean framework for this. In their doctrine, an inferior force that did not retreat was either poorly led, or operating under a logic the superior force had not yet identified. The second possibility was always more dangerous than the first. The flagship's engine signature shifted. Not forward. Lateral. A course correction. Moving the formation to a wider approach vector. One that added approximately 3 hours of travel time to their intercept course. Buying time to think. Vale Soren exhaled slowly. They're not withdrawing, Oren noted. No, she said. But they're not advancing on the original timeline either. They're reassessing. Tessavin, who had been watching silently from the far side of the room, spoke. What does that give us? 3 hours, Vale Soren said. Maybe more if they keep reassessing. She paused. It also tells us something about how they're reading this situation. Which is? She thought about the transmission. The careful wording. Do you understand the consequences of your position? Not a threat technically. A question. And the implicit logic underneath, we see what you're doing and we cannot determine why you're doing it, and that uncertainty is costing us something. They're not sure this is a bluff, she said. And they're not sure it isn't. And the cost of being wrong in either direction is significant. Thar created that uncertainty deliberately. Yes. She turned back to the display. That's what I mean when I say Tier 2 behavioral models don't apply. This is not an inexperienced species reacting to a crisis. This is a species that has learned to operate in conditions of severe resource disadvantage and make that disadvantage work for them. She thought about what she knew of Earth's history. The centuries of scarcity and pressure. The technologies born in desperation. And the doctrine, never formally written down anywhere she had found in the intercepts, that seemed to run underneath all of it. If you cannot win the fight, change what the fight is about. Next, Part 4, what the Rathcali didn't know, the 3-hour window. What Thar does with it. And the piece of human history that Vale Soren finally understands, the thing no consortium analyst had ever thought to classify. In the 3 hours that the Rathcali formation spent on its adjusted approach vector, buying time to reassess, to consult, to run whatever calculations their flagship command staff ran when they encountered an equation that didn't resolve cleanly, Commander Elias Thar did several things. Vale Soren only learned most of them afterward. In the moment, watching the tactical display from Hellas 4's operations center, she could observe outcomes but not process. She saw effects without yet understanding the full architecture of causes. What she could observe, the Resolute did not move. It held its position in the intercept zone with an engine signature so quiet it was almost meditative. No active scanning. No weapons powering up. No aggressive posturing that might give the Rathcali an excuse to reclassify the situation as mutual confrontation. Just presence. Deliberate, unmistakable, documented presence. What she learned afterward. In those 3 hours, Thar conducted separate communications with each of his 11 ships, the station's engineering department, the consortium's diplomatic relay office, and 3 independent commercial cargo operators who had docked at Hellas 4 within the last 48 hours. The cargo operators were the part she found most interesting. They were representatives of 3 different species, a Keth independent hauler, a Suvari shipping cooperative, and a Draylon trade consortium. None of them were military. None of them had any formal role in the corridor security arrangement. Andar had apparently spent approximately 15 minutes with each of them, explaining the situation in precise, non-alarming terms, and asking them a single question. If this corridor becomes a Rathcali-controlled transit zone, what does that mean for your routes? The answers Vale Soren learned from the post-incident records were not favorable to the Rathcali. The Draylon Consortium alone projected a 23% increase in shipping costs if Hellas 7 transitioned to Rathcali domain zone pricing. The Suvari Cooperative would lose access to 2 of their 4 primary trade lines entirely. Thar had asked each of them to file a formal economic impact statement with the consortium's Commerce Review Board. All 3 did so within the 3-hour window. It was not a dramatic act. It generated no weapons signatures on anyone's tactical display. It would not appear in the immediate incident reports as a significant development. But it was the kind of move that metastasized. 3 independent commercial entities representing 3 different species and 6 separate trade networks had now created a formal paper record of economic harm tied to a potential Rathcali territorial claim. That record would not expire. It would sit in the consortium's commerce archives, and the next time the Rathcali tried to push their domain claims anywhere near compact designated space, those filings would be there. Available to any arbitration board. Admissible in any formal review. Thar had used the time between crisis and confrontation to build future leverage. Vale Soren sat with that information for a long while after she first read the post-incident report. Then she opened a new section in her academic file on humanity and typed a single heading. Long timeline strategic thinking in acute crisis scenarios, human model. She thought about it in the context of everything she had learned about Earth's history. The civilizations that had shaped humanity's strategic culture had not, by and large, been powerful ones. That was the thing that kept surfacing in her research, the pattern she had noted but never fully integrated into her models. Human history, at least the last several centuries of it, the period that had forged the civilization now sitting across from a Rathcali fleet, had been defined not by great empires at their height but by peoples and nations navigating conditions of disadvantage. She had studied the intercept translations of human historical texts extensively. The military histories were particularly instructive. They were full of engagements in which one side had been numerically or technologically inferior and had compensated through, the term that appeared again and again in different languages and different eras, asymmetric thinking. The deliberate identification of which rules of the engagement could be rewritten, which assumptions of the stronger party could be exploited, which costs could be imposed that the superior force had not priced into its calculation. It was not the same as cleverness. Cleverness was reactive. This was structural. It was a way of approaching every problem from the starting position of I cannot win this the conventional way, so what is the unconventional way? Most civilizations that reached the stars had long histories of dominance. The Keth had been the preeminent power in their region for 6 centuries before first contact with other spacefaring species. The Rathcali had expanded steadily for 400 years with few serious challenges. Even among compact members, the majority of elder species had developed their strategic cultures in contexts of relative strength. Humanity had not. The centuries of scarcity and crisis that had driven human technological development had done something to human strategic thinking that Vale Soren had not properly accounted for. They had normalized disadvantage. They had built into the deep structure of how humans approached conflict a default orientation toward the question that stronger powers almost never had to ask. How do I win from a position I shouldn't be able to win from? That question, practiced for generations, had become reflex. At 1347 station time, the Rathcali formation completed its course adjustment and resumed approach on the new vector. Still toward the station. Still not withdrawing. But the formation had changed shape again. The 40 ships had spread into a wider dispersion pattern. In Rathcali tactical doctrine, which Vale Soren had reviewed extensively in the consortium's military analysis archive, a spread dispersion was defensive, not offensive. It reduced the effectiveness of coordinated fire by an opposing force and minimized the damage profile of any preemptive strike. They were no longer approaching as a hammer. They were approaching as a field. They're worried about something, Oren said, studying the formation shift. They're worried about what they don't know, Vale Soren said. The Resolute shouldn't be this confident. The 12-ship screen shouldn't have held position. The cargo operators shouldn't have filed those economic reports. She paused. They're looking at a set of behaviors that don't conform to Tier 2 doctrine and they're asking what they're missing. Are they missing anything? Tessavin asked. Vale Soren thought about it carefully. In terms of raw military capacity, the human ships in the corridor were genuinely outmatched. That was real. The Resolute could not destroy the Rathcali flagship in a direct engagement. The 12-ship screen could impose costs and complicate an advance but could not stop 40 warships from reaching the station if those ships were willing to absorb the losses. But the Rathcali were not calculating against the ships in the corridor. They were calculating against an unknown. Against a species whose behavior patterns suggested depth they couldn't see. Against the possibility that humanity's apparent confidence was grounded in something. A reserve force, a compact response already en route, a prepared defensive system aboard the station, something that their intelligence had not captured. They didn't know that the nearest consortium response force was 19 hours away. They didn't know that the station's defense grid would last approximately 11 minutes against a determined assault. They didn't know that there had no reserves, no hidden assets, no cavalry coming. All they knew was that humanity was behaving like it did. And that was enough. What they're missing, Vale Soren said finally, is the fact that there's nothing behind him. He's what there is. She let that settle for a moment. But they can't rule out that they're wrong. And the cost of being wrong is a full-scale compact response to an unprovoked attack on a transit zone. A diplomatic situation that limits their domain expansion for the next century. Tessavin folded his hands. So we're being defended by the limits of Rathkali intelligence gathering. You're being defended by a human commander who understood that those limits existed and positioned himself to exploit them. She looked at the display. It's the same thing from different angles. At 1412, the Rathkali flagship transmitted again. This time to the consortium diplomatic relay, not to the Resolute. The message requested a formal arbitration session regarding corridor access rights. In Rathkali diplomatic language, Vale Soren knew, requesting arbitration was not a retreat. It was a conditional pause. A way of stepping back from the edge without formally acknowledging that there had been an edge. But it was functionally what it was. Tessavin read the message twice. Then he looked at Vale Soren with an expression she had no clean category for. Something between relief and the particular discomfort of realizing you had underestimated something important. File an urgent revision to your academic report, he said quietly. And send a copy to the Contact Evaluation Board. Recommending what reclassification? He thought about it. Start with Tier 2 and work upward, he said. You'll know when to stop. The Rathkali formation completed its withdrawal 18 hours after the arbitration request. Not quickly. Not cleanly. In the manner of a force that wanted its departure to communicate deliberateness rather than defeat. A careful, measured pulling back that preserved, in form if not in substance, the appearance of a tactical choice freely made. Vale Soren had enough background in Rathkali behavioral psychology to read it correctly. This was not retreat. This was strategic repositioning, which in Rathkali cultural terms meant something closer to choosing not to escalate today, with all the implied patience of a civilization that thought in generational timelines. They would be back. Not immediately and probably not in the same configuration. But the Hellas corridor was still valuable, the Rathkali still wanted it, and the political arithmetic of the region had not changed permanently. What had changed was one variable, the presence of humanity in the corridor equation, which had previously been assigned a weight close to zero and now needed to be reassigned entirely. That reassignment, Vale Soren knew, would happen in rooms she would never see, by analysts whose methodology she couldn't evaluate. Whatever the Rathkali intelligence apparatus concluded about humanity in the aftermath of the Hellas incident would shape the next decade of interstellar politics in this region. She thought about what they would find. A species with 12 ships in this corridor and perhaps 200 in total across its expanded patrol territory. A civilization 19 years into FTL operation, still developing its industrial capacity, still learning how to sustain deep space logistics. Militarily, by any conventional metric, not yet a power. And yet those 12 ships had held a corridor against 40. And the holding had not been achieved through firepower or formation strength or technological superiority. It had been achieved through something that no intelligence analyst could easily quantify, the particular weight of a single ship in a position it had no business being in, behaving with a certainty it had no objective grounds for. That weight, Vale Soren had come to understand, was not irrational. It was the product of a very specific kind of institutional knowledge. The knowledge of what it felt like to have no good options and to act anyway. She had thought, in the early years of her study, that this was a human pathology. A civilizational scar from centuries of crisis. Something to be grown out of as the species matured and stabilized. She no longer believed that. She requested a meeting with R 2 days after the withdrawal. He agreed without hesitation and came to her research office on the station's residential level. A small, cluttered room whose walls were covered in printed star charts and comparative civilization timelines. He looked at the charts for a moment before sitting down. "You've been busy," he said. "It's my work." She settled across from him. "How are you?" He seemed slightly surprised by the question. "Fine. processing a lot of incident reports. The consortium wants a detailed timeline of the tactical decision sequence. I know. I've been asked to contribute an analysis. She studied him. I want to ask you something directly if that's acceptable. Go ahead. When you positioned the Resolute in the intercept zone, before you knew what the other 11 ships would do, what was your actual assessment of the engagement outcome if the Rathcali decided to advance on your position? He was quiet for a moment. The pause of someone being careful to be honest rather than careful to sound good. Not favorable, he said. Depending on how they approached, we could have imposed meaningful cost. Probably taken down 2, maybe 3 ships before they closed the distance. After that, he shook his head slightly. Not favorable. But you moved anyway. Yes. Why? He looked at her with an expression that was neither defensive nor proud. Just considered. Because not moving was also a choice. And not moving had its own consequences. The station, the cargo operators, the diplomatic precedent, the Rathcali understanding of what this corridor is worth defending. He paused. If we pull back when they advance, we've answered a question for them. We've told them that compact affiliates will yield under force, and that the human ships in this corridor specifically will yield. That answer has a long life. We'd be dealing with its consequences for years. But you might have been destroyed. Yes. And you accepted that. He thought about it. Accepted isn't quite the right word. I accounted for it. It was a real possibility and I planned for it. The broadcast, the cargo operator filings, those were partially about making sure that if the Resolute was taken out, the incident didn't die with us. The record would exist regardless. He was quiet for a moment. But I didn't think they would fire. The calculation was too costly for them. You were betting on their risk assessment being rational. I was betting on the fact that a 400-year territorial expansion civilization doesn't risk a century of diplomatic consequences for one corridor. Not when they can pause and reassess. He met her eyes. I've read enough about the Rathcali to know they think in long timelines. Long timeline thinkers don't make short timeline mistakes if you give them a clear view of the cost. Vale Soren was silent for a moment. Then, and if you had been wrong? Then I'd have been wrong, he said simply. But I'd have been wrong in a documented incident that gave the compact legal grounds to formalize Rathcali exclusion. The station might not have survived, but the corridor would have been defended in the record. That matters. She studied him. You calculated your own death as an input variable. It was a variable, he agreed. Not one I was indifferent to. The faint ghost of something, not quite a smile. I have people I'd like to see again. She absorbed that. Your fleet, she said finally. The other 11 ships, you contacted them during the 3-hour window. I did. What did you tell them? He was quiet for a moment. Then, I told them the situation. The real situation, not a sanitized version. The Rathcali numbers, our capacity, the realistic engagement scenarios. I told them what I was doing and why. And I told them that the withdrawal order they'd received was technically compliant with pulling back to secondary positions, and that if they wanted to interpret their secondary positions as covering the corridor approaches, that was a tactically valid reading. He paused. I didn't order them to do it. But they did it. Yes. Why? He looked at her steadily. Because they're good officers who understood the situation the same way I did. They didn't need to be ordered. They needed to understand what was happening and have the space to make their own call. He paused. I trust them. Vale Soren sat back. There it was. The thing she had been circling around in her academic analysis without finding the right framing for. Not just strategic sophistication. Not just adaptability under pressure. The institutional capacity to build trust quickly, delegate judgment appropriately, and coordinate without requiring a command structure to specify every response. In Keth military culture, in most spacefaring military cultures she had studied, that kind of distributed decision-making was considered a liability, a source of inconsistency. Command structures existed to prevent 11 ships from making 11 individual interpretations of an order. Thar had used the ambiguity in the order as a feature, not a bug. He had trusted his people to read the situation correctly, and they had. I need to revise my classification report significantly, she said. He looked at the star charts on her wall. What's the current classification? Tier 2. What's the scale? 1 to 6. 6 being the Keth and their nearest peers. He nodded slowly. Where do you think it lands now? She considered it carefully. I don't know, she said. That's the honest answer. I'm not sure our classification system has a category for what I observed over the last 4 days. She met his eyes. The metrics we use are based on technology, population, economic output, military mass. On every one of those metrics, humanity is tier 2. But the way you use what you have, she shook her head slightly. I don't have a metric for that. There was quiet for a moment. Then, for what it's worth, I think your framework is fine. I think you just encountered an edge case. An edge case that held off a 40-ship fleet. Edge cases are disproportionately represented in the interesting parts of history, he said. That's what makes them edge cases. She laughed before she could stop herself, a short, involuntary sound. He smiled. Outside, through the station's observation panels, the Hellas corridor was quiet. Empty. The Rathcali Formation had cleared the boundary marker 6 hours ago and was no longer on any passive sensor. For now the corridor held. The revised report took Vale Soren 11 days to complete. It was the most careful piece of writing she had produced in 20 years of academic work, not because the material was difficult, but because she understood, with unusual clarity, that its conclusions would be acted upon. Academic papers on minor species classification rarely had consequences that extended beyond the slow grind of bureaucratic reclassification procedures. This one, she suspected, would be different. She titled it, Reassessment of Tier Classification Methodology in Emergent Civilizations, a Case Analysis of Human Strategic Behavior in the Hellas 7 Incident. The title was deliberately dry. She had learned, in 2 decades in consortium academia, that dry titles produced less institutional friction. The content was not dry. The core argument was straightforward, built on 3 pillars: observational data from the incident itself, comparative analysis of human military history intercepts, and a theoretical framework she had developed across the 11 days of writing for what she called pressure-adapted strategic culture. The argument was, in brief, that humanity's centuries of civilizational stress had produced not a damaged or scarred species but one with a particular kind of strategic depth that conventional tier classification metrics could not capture, and that this depth had been demonstrated in the Hellas incident in ways that had direct implications for consortium foreign policy. The specific implications she listed in the report's conclusion were 7 in number. The Consortium Contact Evaluation Board received the report on the 14th day after the incident. Vale Soren received an acknowledgement within hours, which was faster than standard. That speed, she had learned over the years, was either a good sign or a very bad one. The response came 6 days later. Not from the Contact Evaluation Board's Standard Review Office but from the board's Senior Policy Director, an elder Keth named Magistrix Solian, who had held the position for 30 years and whose communications Vale Soren had received exactly twice before in her career, both times related to matters of significant political sensitivity. The message was brief. Dr. Vale Soren, your report has been reviewed at senior level. Your methodology is sound and your observational analysis is well supported. We would like to discuss the conclusions with you before proceeding to formal publication. Please arrange transit to the board's central offices at your earliest opportunity. This matter is time-sensitive. Solian. Vale Soren read it 3 times. Then she packed her research materials and booked transit to Keth Prime. The board's central offices occupied a building that was, by design, understated. The consortium's political philosophy emphasized deliberation over display, and nothing about the low-lit corridors and plain conference chambers that Vale Soren walked through suggested power. But the species and ranks represented in the rooms she passed, glimpsed through open doors, visible in the composition of the administrative staff, told a different story. Magistrix Solian received her in a conference chamber with a view of Keth Prime's northern hemisphere cloud formations and the particular cool efficiency of someone who had been waiting for this conversation and had prepared accordingly. Your report is excellent, Solian said. There was no preamble, which Vale Soren had expected. The methodology is defensible and the case study is well constructed. The board has no objection to the academic substance. Then the problem is the conclusions, Vale Soren said. The problem is what the conclusions imply. Solian steepled her hands. You are recommending that humanity's tier classification be revised upward, and that the revision be accompanied by a recalibration of our classification methodology to include what you call pressure-adapted strategic culture. Yes. If that recommendation is implemented, humanity's formal tier status increases. With that increase comes a corresponding change in their standing in compact proceedings. Voting weight on border arbitrations, access to enhanced technology exchange provisions, priority consideration in commercial route negotiations. Solian paused. And an obligation, under the Third Compact's mutual defense clauses, for consortium members to provide material support in any hostile engagement against a compact affiliate above Tier 3. Vale Soren had known this when she wrote the report. She had included a footnote acknowledging the policy implications. Yes, that's accurate. The Rathkali are not compact members, Solian said carefully. They are not bound by our mutual defense provisions. But they respond to our formal positions. If we formally elevate humanity's tier status in the direct aftermath of a standoff with a Rathkali fleet, we are sending a message. We are indicating that we view the Hellas incident as having demonstrated something significant about human capability, and that we are adjusting our formal relationships accordingly. That's an accurate reading of what the report recommends, Vale Soren said. And the Rathkali will read it as provocation. They will read it as the consortium formally backing humanity's position in the corridor dispute. Solian met her eyes. Which could accelerate exactly the kind of confrontation the incident temporarily avoided. Vale Soren was quiet for a moment. She had not been naive about the politics when she wrote the report. But hearing them articulated this plainly, she felt the weight of the specific trade-off in a way the footnote had not captured. With respect, Magistrix, she said finally, I think the alternative is worse. Explain. The Rathkali will return to the Hellas corridor. Not in weeks, perhaps not in years. But they'll return. And when they do, they'll have a more complete intelligence picture of humanity's actual capacity in the corridor. They'll have corrected whatever uncertainty deterred them this time. She kept her voice measured. If we delay the reclassification, if we maintain humanity's Tier 2 status, we're not preventing confrontation. We're allowing it to develop on a timeline where the deterrent that worked last time has been eroded and we haven't replaced it with anything. You're arguing for preemptive commitment. I'm arguing for honest assessment. The Hellas incident demonstrated that humanity can function as a meaningful defensive force in compact affiliated space. Whether that's convenient for our policy timetable doesn't change whether it's true. She paused. And if we suppress an accurate assessment because it creates friction with the Rathkali, we've made a choice about what kind of organization this consortium is. Solian studied her for a long moment. The board is not suppressing your report, she said carefully. We are considering how to sequence its release. The findings, when published, will have effects. The sequencing can mitigate some of those effects. How long is the sequencing? 18 months, under standard sensitive classification review. Vale Soren felt the specific exhaustion of watching a bureaucratic process absorb an urgent truth and slowly, carefully neutralize its urgency. 18 months, she said. Possibly less. It depends on developments. What kind of developments? Solian's expression was unreadable. The kind that make the question of whether to reclassify humanity moot because the situation has already changed. She stood, signaling the end of the meeting. You'll be informed when the review is complete. Vale Soren walked out of the conference chamber and stood for a moment in the corridor, looking at the cloud formations through the window. She thought about the resolute holding position in the Hellas corridor with 40 ships on approach and 19 hours between the station and any consortium response. She thought about what he had said. If you don't move, you've answered a question for them. She went back to her temporary office in the board's guest wing and opened her research terminal. She began writing. Not the formal report, that was in review, locked in Solian's careful 18 months. Something else. A public record commentary on classification methodology, framed in academic language, citing the Hellas incident as a case study without specifying the classified conclusions. Not the message she had wanted to send. But the message she could send now through channels that didn't require a board approval. The Rathkali thought in long timelines. So did she. The Rathkali returned to the Hellas corridor in the early weeks of the second year after the incident. Not with 40 ships. With 11. Vale Soren was on Waystation Hellas 4 when the contact reports came in. She had arranged a long-term research posting on the station as part of the project that had quietly grown out of her public record commentary. The commentary had circulated further than she had anticipated. It had been cited in 3 separate compact policy reviews, discussed in 2 academic conferences, and referenced in an internal memorandum by the consortium's military analysis department that she was not supposed to have seen but had been forwarded by a colleague who thought she'd find it relevant. She found it very relevant. The memorandum had recommended, in careful bureaucratic language, that the consortium increase cooperative patrol arrangements with humanity in the Hellas corridor on a provisional basis pending formal review of tier classification methodology. It was not the reclassification. It was not the mutual defense trigger. It was the specific, narrow, politically minimizable thing that the board could do without formally committing to anything, which, Veilsoren had long since accepted, was how the consortium actually moved. In increments. In provisionals. In the quiet accumulation of small adjustments that eventually became policy. The provisional arrangement had been implemented 6 months after her commentary published. Humanity now had 22 ships assigned to the Hellas corridor. Nearly double the original patrol strength, with 3 new relay stations positioned between the corridor's outer boundary and the main transit hub. And when the Rathkali returned, 11 ships this time on the exact same approach vector as before, moving at the same deliberate pace that communicated intent without yet constituting aggression. They were met by a very different contact signal. Not just the Resolute. The whole patrol. Veilsoren watched the contact unfold from the operations center with the particular calm of someone who has spent long enough in a situation to recognize its rhythms. The Rathkali formation held at the boundary marker for 9 hours. During those 9 hours, the human patrol ships maintained their screen formation, transmitted formal warnings on schedule, and filed the required incident documentation with the consortium's diplomatic relay. No confrontation. No weapons signatures. Clean, documented, persistent defensive presence. On the 10th hour, the Rathkali formation withdrew. There was no transmission requesting arbitration this time. No request at all. Just the drive signatures of 11 ships reversing course and disappearing from the passive sensor net. Prelin, the station's tactical officer who had been present during the first incident, stood next to Veilsoren at the display and watched the contact signatures fade. They didn't even ask, he said. They knew the answer, she said. They were testing whether the answer had changed. And it hasn't. No. She paused. If anything, it's gotten clearer. Prelin was quiet for a moment. What do you think they'll do next? Recalculate. Again. She thought about it. The 11-ship probe was intelligence work. They wanted to know whether the Hellas patrol had been permanently strengthened or whether the doubling was temporary. Now they know. She folded her hands. They'll adjust their timeline. Find a different approach. Maybe a different corridor. They're patient. So what does humanity do in the meantime? Keep doing this, she said. Keep being here. Keep being expensive to displace. She turned away from the display. That's the strategy as far as I can tell. It's not complicated. It's just consistent. She met with Thar that evening. He was on a rotation through the corridor now, commanding the patrol group from the Resolute for 3-month stretches before rotating back to Earth Combined Void Fleet's Central Command for administrative periods. The arrangement suited him, she thought. He seemed more at ease in operational settings than in the paperwork of fleet headquarters. They sat in the station's small civilian cafe, which had grown considerably since the Hellas incident. 3 new commercial operators had established berths at Hellas 4 in the past 18 months, drawn by the improved security profile of the corridor. The Draylon Consortium alone had expanded its routing through the station by 40%. Thar had a cup of something warm and was reading an incident summary on his personal terminal when she arrived. The second probe, she said, settling across from him. Clean withdrawal, he said. Good. Do you think they'll try a third time? He considered it. In the corridor? Probably not soon. The cost-benefit doesn't improve for them with this patrol strength. He set down the terminal. They'll look for a softer point. There are several. The compact's coverage gaps haven't been fully addressed. That's an argument for expanding coverage. It's an argument for a lot of things. I put them in my reports. He shrugged slightly. Whether they become policy depends on things above my pay grade. She smiled at the human expression, which she had come to recognize. I've been thinking about something, she said. Something I want to ask you, and I want you to understand it's not an academic question. I'm asking because I genuinely don't know. He looked at her attentively. She had come to appreciate that about him, the quality of his attention. He didn't perform interest. He either was or wasn't engaged, and when he was, it was complete. The first incident, she said. When you moved into the intercept position. Before you calculated the diplomatic geometry, before you thought about the cargo operators and the arbitration precedent, in the first moment when you made the decision to move rather than withdraw, what was it actually about? He was quiet for a long time. Long enough that she wondered if she had asked something unanswerable. There were people on this station, he said finally. And on the cargo ships. And in the civilian quarter. He looked at his hands for a moment. I know that's not a strategic answer. It might be the truest one. The strategy came after, he said. The calculation, the leverage building, the cargo operators, all of that came after. But the first moment? He paused. The first moment it was just, there are people here. And the only thing between them and 40 ships is us. He was quiet. You don't have to have a philosophy for that. You just have to be willing to be between them. Vale Soren sat with that. She had spent nearly 2 years building an academic framework for human strategic behavior. Pressure-adapted culture. Long timeline asymmetric thinking. Institutional trust and distributed decision-making. All of it was real. All of it was documented and defensible and would eventually, she believed, reshape how the consortium classified and engaged with humanity. But here, in the quiet of a station cafe with the corridor empty and the Rathcali probe withdrawn, she understood that the framework was the analysis, not the source. The source was simpler. More human. There are people here. And we're between them. She thought about Earth's history again. The centuries of crisis and scarcity and hard adaptation. She had always framed those centuries as the forge that produced humanity's strategic depth, and that was true as far as it went. But the forge had produced something else too. Not just sophistication. Not just the capacity to find leverage and disadvantage. It had produced, in the people who had survived it, a very clear sense of what mattered and what didn't. What was worth standing between and what wasn't. What you absorbed and what you didn't yield. That clarity, stripped of abstraction by centuries of people who hadn't had the luxury of abstraction, was what she had watched standing in an intercept position in the Hellas corridor. Not arrogance. Not recklessness. Not the naive heroics of a young civilization that didn't yet understand the scale of the galaxy. Just a commander who knew where the line was. 2 weeks later, Vale Soren received a message from Magistrix Solian. The Contact Evaluation Board had completed its review of her report. The formal reclassification of humanity was being approved, effective at the beginning of the next compact cycle. Tier 3 with a notation recommending reassessment within 5 years. Not Tier 4. Not the full weight of the Mutual Defense Clause. Step. A measured, bureaucratically defensible, consortium-paced step. She read the message twice. Then she set her terminal down and looked out the observation panel at the Hellas corridor. Quiet now, the approach markers blinking their slow rhythmic green. The patrol ships on their rotation. 22 of them now, spread across the corridor approaches in the geometry that had become, over the past 18 months, simply normal. One step. She thought about Thar's phrase. Long timeline thinkers don't make short timeline mistakes if you give them a clear view of the cost. The consortium moved in steps, and each step was small, and the steps accumulated. That was also, she reflected, a very human kind of patience. The patience of people who had learned that you rarely get what you need all at once. You hold the position. You build the record. You make the cost of displacing you higher than the value of the space you occupy. You stay. She opened her research terminal and began the proposal for her next project. A comprehensive study of human military doctrine across first contact scenarios, with particular focus on the relationship between strategic culture and civilizational history. The title she chose was deliberately dry. The content would not be